At 72 years old, Eleanor Vance stood in the freezing November rain and broke the legal seal on the abandoned Victorian mansion her children had just sold. But what Dents and Sarah didn't know, what their polished greed completely blinded them to, was that this crumbling property held a 30-year-old secret. What she was about to find behind these decaying walls would systematically dismantle their corporate empire. If you've ever watched the people you sacrificed everything for treat you like an expired inconvenience, this is for you. If you've ever been stripped of your dignity by those who owe you their entire success, keep listening. If you've ever stood in the cold with nothing left but the truth, pay attention. Subscribe now. Because what Eleanor uncovered when she finally crossed that ruined threshold will make you believe that absolute justice never misses its mark. The rain fell in heavy sheets against the slate roof. Water poured from broken gutters and carved deep trenches in the dead lawn. Eleanor pulled the collar of her worn navy wool coat tight against her neck. Her scuffed leather walking shoes were soaked entirely through. She stood before the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. A heavy modern chain held the center bars together. A bright yellow notice hung from the cold metal. It declared the property a toxic asset, scheduled for immediate demolition. Her son's company logo was printed at the bottom in crisp black ink. Eleanor did not look at the logo for long. She moved to the far left side of the brick perimeter wall. The bricks were crumbling under decades of thick, dead ivy. She found the narrow gap where an old oak tree had pushed the wall apart. She turned sideways and stepped through the opening. Wet branches scraped loudly against her fraying trousers. She slipped on a patch of slick mud, but caught herself against the rough tree trunk. Her breath came in short, visible clouds in the freezing air. The main house loomed ahead through the dense fog. It was 3 stories of dark wood and shattered windows. Vines crawled up the sides, completely choking the porch pillars. The wide wooden veranda sagged heavily in the middle. Eleanor walked slowly up the cracked concrete path. The grounds were completely silent except for the sound of the rain. She bypassed the massive front double doors. They were boarded over with thick plywood and secured with steel bolts. Instead, she moved carefully along the edge of the rotting porch. She tested each wooden board with her toe before placing her full weight down. 2 boards snapped completely, dropping wet wood down into the dark crawl space. She kept her balance and continued around to the eastern side of the house. Here, the vegetation grew wildly out of control. Rhododendron bushes had merged into a solid, imposing wall of dead branches. Eleanor reached directly into the center of the brush. The sharp thorns tore at the sleeves of her wool coat. She gripped the thickest dead branches and pulled them back with her calloused hands. Her knuckles scraped hard against the hidden brick wall behind the bushes. She ignored the stinging pain and kept pulling the branches away. A narrow, weathered wooden door finally appeared behind the overgrowth. Its dark green paint was flaking off in large, damp strips. The heavy iron hinges were solid lumps of orange rust. A brass keyhole sat directly in the center of the wood. Eleanor reached inside her wet coat collar. Her cold fingers found the braided leather cord resting against her collarbone. She pulled it slowly upward. At the end of the cord hung a heavy, tarnished brass key. The metal was worn completely smooth on one side. Her hands were shaking heavily from the cold. She gripped the brass key tightly to steady her fingers. She inserted the metal into the rusted lock. It did not turn. The lock was seized from decades of rain and complete neglect. She pulled the key back out halfway and pushed it in again with more force. She leaned her right shoulder against the wet wood of the door. She applied her entire body weight and twisted her wrist hard. A sharp, metallic crack echoed loudly in the small space. The rusted tumblers broke free and suddenly aligned. The heavy internal latch dropped open. Eleanor pushed the door inward. It dragged violently against the swollen floorboards inside. She stepped out of the rain and into the pitch-black hallway. The air inside was trapped and stale. It smelled of rotting paper, damp plaster, and freezing dust. She pushed the heavy door shut behind her. The thick wood sealed out the sound of the storm completely. She stood perfectly still in the dark. Water dripped steadily from the hem of her coat onto the hardwood floor. The hollow sound of the drops echoed down the long, empty corridor. She let the brass key drop back against her chest. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the deep gloom. Faint grey light filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows. She could see the outline of a narrow staircase ahead. Dust motes hung suspended in the still, freezing air. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of grey grime. The house had been waiting in complete silence for 30 years. She placed her wet hand against the hallway wall. The old wallpaper was peeling away in long, dry strips. She took her first step forward into the abandoned house. The floorboards groaned loudly under her weight. It was a deep, structural sound that vibrated up through her soaked shoes. She moved past an old wooden chair lying broken on its side. A piece of torn fabric still clung to its splintered leg. She did not stop to examine it. She moved without hesitating in the dark. She passed the doorway leading to the ruined kitchens. The smell of mold was strongest there. She kept walking toward the center of the mansion. Her wet clothes clung to her freezing skin, but her posture remained perfectly straight. Eleanor Vance was 72 years old when she stepped into the ruined main parlor. She had designed the original crown molding in this exact room 4 decades ago. She had been 3 credits short of receiving her architectural degree. Arthur had just secured the muddy land for his first commercial project. He needed a draftsman, but could not afford to pay one. Eleanor closed her textbooks that evening and never returned to the university. She set up a slanted wooden drafting board in the corner of their cramped kitchen. She drew the structural plans for the company's first 12 buildings by hand. She worked under a single harsh bulb while Arthur slept in the next room. For 40 years she managed the quietest crises of the family empire. She never held an official title. She never drew a salary. She answered the landline at 2 in the morning when the site foreman called. She mediated the angry strikes with the steelworkers over folding tables in freezing lots. She pledged her grandmother's wedding ring as collateral for the first cement mixers. When David and Sarah were born, she moved the heavy drafting board into the nursery. She drafted the blueprints for the downtown high-rises with a baby resting on her hip. She calculated load-bearing columns while mashing peas into small plastic bowls. She drove the children to private schools, funded by the concrete she helped pour. She reviewed zoning laws in the public library while they were at soccer practice. She typed permit applications on a manual typewriter until her fingers cramped. She sat at the kitchen island helping David with his calculus homework. She proofread Sarah's college application essays late into the night. She packed their dorm room boxes and drove them to their expensive universities. She attended every parent-teacher conference and graduation ceremony alone. Arthur was always at the ribbon-cutting ceremonies for the new buildings. Eleanor stood in the back of the crowds at those grand openings. She wore simple grey wool suits and kept her hands folded. She never corrected the journalists who called Arthur a self-made genius. When the company faced bankruptcy in 1992, she quietly sold her inherited silver. She handed the cash directly to the payroll manager to keep the crew working. She never told Arthur where the money came from. She trusted the structure they were building together. She remembered one specific night in the winter of 1988. Arthur came home smelling of damp earth, diesel fuel, and cheap tobacco. He walked into the kitchen and put his heavy hands on her shoulders. He brought her a lukewarm coffee in a white paper cup. He set it down carefully on the edge of the drafting table. He looked down at the sprawling blueprint covering the surface. He tapped the center of the paper with a dirt-stained finger. He traced the lines of the steel framework with his thumb. He said they were pouring a foundation that would protect the children forever. He said nothing could ever shake what they were building. She believed the warmth in his voice and the dirt on his hands. Her days before the betrayal were quiet and strictly orderly. She woke at 5 o'clock every morning in the glass penthouse. She walked across the heated marble floors in her bare feet. She brewed 1 cup of black coffee in the silent kitchen. She wiped the pristine granite countertops with a damp white cloth. She watered the potted orchids lined up along the southern window. She checked the soil moisture with her index finger. She clipped away the dead leaves with small steel scissors. She sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the city wake up. She read the financial sections of 2 physical newspapers. She checked the stock prices of the company she had built from nothing. She folded the papers into perfect squares when she was finished. The brass key hung heavy against her collarbone in the freezing parlor. Arthur had given it to her on his last afternoon alive. His breathing had been shallow and rattling in the sterile hospital bed. He asked the nurses to step out into the hallway. He reached into the drawer of the bedside table with a shaking hand. He pulled out the braided leather cord. The tarnished brass key dangled heavily from the end. He placed it directly into her palm and closed her fingers tightly over the metal. He told her to keep it completely hidden from David and Sarah. He told her she would know exactly when to use it. He died 3 hours later. She had worn the key under her collar every single day since. The betrayal happened on a Tuesday morning in the bright glass penthouse. The winter sun reflected harshly off the polished white marble floors. The light caught the dust motes dancing slowly in the silent, heated air. Eleanor was wearing her simple grey wool suit and sensible low-heeled shoes. She stood by the kitchen island holding a damp white cloth. She had just finished wiping down the pristine granite countertops. The private elevator chimed softly at the far end of the hall. The heavy steel doors slid open with a quiet mechanical hum. David and Sarah stepped out into the wide foyer together. David wore a custom-tailored navy suit and expensive leather shoes. He carried a thin, hard-sided leather briefcase in his right hand. Sarah wore a camel cashmere coat over a designer silk blouse. She held a thick manila envelope tightly against her chest. They did not take off their shoes at the entrance. They tracked wet, grey snow directly across the clean marble floor. Eleanor watched the muddy footprints stain the pristine white stone. David set his wet briefcase directly onto the clean granite countertop. He popped the brass latches open with a sharp, metallic click. He did not look his mother in the eyes. "We're worried about you, Mum," David said smoothly. He pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from the leather case. "This penthouse is simply too large for one person to maintain." Sarah stepped forward and placed her envelope next to the papers. "At your age, you can't manage alone," Sarah added. "We're just being realistic. This is what's best for everyone." Eleanor set the damp cloth down slowly on the marble island. She looked down at the legal documents spreading across her kitchen counter. The top page bore the heavy embossed seal of the corporate attorneys. The bold black letters spelled out a formal notice of immediate eviction. It was a complete asset liquidation and removal order. Sarah picked up a silver spoon from the stainless steel drying rack. She turned it over to check her reflection in the curved metal. She carefully smoothed a stray blonde hair behind her ear. She placed the spoon back down onto the metal rack. She left it deliberately misaligned with the other flatware. "The corporate board voted unanimously this morning," David said. He straightened the edges of the legal papers with his thumbs. "Dad left the holding company entirely to us. It is legally binding." Eleanor looked at her son's perfectly manicured, clean hands. These were hands that had never poured concrete or framed a wall. "I drafted the original structural charters for those buildings," Eleanor said quietly. David slid an expensive silver pen across the granite toward her. It stopped exactly at the edge of the printed signature line. "But your name isn't on the incorporation papers, Mother," David said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah tapped her manicured fingernails lightly against the manila envelope. "You should have been more financially responsible, Mom," Sarah said gently. "This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead." Eleanor stood perfectly still in the bright, freezing kitchen. She stared at the daughter whose college tuition she had funded with inherited silver. The cruelty of the moment was completely polished and entirely legal. David checked the face of his heavy gold wristwatch. "The movers will be here at noon to pack the furniture," he said. "We have secured a very nice assisted living facility for you. You will be so much more comfortable there." Sarah smiled. "Dad would have wanted this." Eleanor did not look at the silver pen. She reached up and felt the heavy brass key through her wool suit. The metal was cold against her collarbone. The glass penthouse to David. The commercial high-rises to Sarah. The corporate bank accounts to the board of directors. While they snapped their leather briefcases shut, already checking their phones for the opening bell of the stock market, Eleanor received what they called the final severance. A single canvas duffel bag, and exactly 1 hour to fill it. David handed her the manila envelope before turning toward the elevator. "There's a bus ticket to the facility inside," he said. "We are not being cruel, Mother. We are being practical." Sarah followed her brother without looking back at the kitchen. "It's a clean break," Sarah called over her shoulder. "This is entirely fair." Eleanor watched the steel elevator doors slide completely shut. She looked at the thick stack of eviction papers on the granite. She did not sign them. She walked to the hall closet and pulled out a faded green canvas bag. She walked into the master bedroom for the last time. She ignored the designer dresses hanging in the massive walk-in closet. She packed exactly 3 changes of practical clothes and her heavy winter sweaters. She packed her grandmother's silver thimble and her worn navy coat. She walked back into the bright kitchen and looked at the countertops. She did not take the bus ticket to the facility. She left the manila envelope sitting untouched next to the silver pen. She walked out of the glass penthouse and into the silent hallway. She carried her canvas bag down 70 flights of concrete stairs. The door clicked shut behind her. Eleanor stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk outside the massive glass tower. The freezing November rain fell heavily against her worn navy coat. She held the straps of her green canvas duffel bag tightly in her calloused hands. The streetlights hummed loudly above her in the grey afternoon gloom. Cars drove past her, splashing dirty water against her scuffed leather shoes. She walked 2 blocks to a rusted metal bus stop bench. She sat down on the cold iron and set the bag beside her. She reached into the deep right pocket of her trousers. She pulled out a small, worn, leather coin purse. The zipper was stiff and caught halfway down the brass track. She pulled it hard and emptied the contents carefully onto her wet palm. She counted a single, crumpled $10 bill. She smoothed the damp paper flat against her knee. She counted 4 damp $1 bills. She counted exactly 1 dime and 2 dull pennies. She had $14.12 left to her name. The corporate accounts she had built over 40 years held millions. She slid the damp money back into the small leather pouch. She zipped it closed and put it away. She reached into the left pocket of her coat and pulled out her mobile phone. The screen was cracked in the top right corner. She pressed the side button to wake the display. The harsh white light illuminated her wet, lined face. She opened her call history. The missed calls counter read 0. She opened her text message inbox. There were no messages from David. There were no messages from Sarah. There were no messages from the corporate attorneys. The only notification was an automated alert from a local pharmacy. It reminded her to refill a blood pressure prescription she could no longer afford. She pressed the power button, and the screen went entirely black. She put the dark rectangle back into her coat pocket. She looked up at the towering glass building she had just left. She could see the lights on the 70th floor cutting through the fog. Those were the lights of the penthouse she had cleaned that morning. She thought, I am 72 years old, and I have nowhere to sleep. I have $14.12, and I cannot rent a room. The rain soaked through her wool coat and reached her shoulders. The cold settled deep into her joints. She thought about walking to the city shelter on 5th Street. She pictured the long lines of desperate people standing in the rain. She pictured the metal cots and the bright fluorescent lights. She pictured handing her canvas bag to a stranger behind a plexiglass window. She reached inside her damp collar with a shaking hand. Her fingers found the thick, braided leather cord. She pulled it out and looked at the heavy brass key. The metal was tarnished and cold against her wet palm. Arthur had told her she would know exactly when to use it. She closed her fist tightly around the rough brass. She remembered the original property deed she had seen 40 years ago, the old Victorian mansion at the edge of the county line, the property David and Sarah called a toxic asset in their meetings, the property they thought was entirely worthless and rotting away. The corporate board had abandoned it decades ago when the roof began to sag. It was the only piece of land not listed in the holding company's modern portfolio. It was the foundation of everything, completely forgotten by everyone. She stood up from the freezing metal bench. She gripped the canvas handles of her duffel bag. She did not walk toward the city shelter. She did not walk back toward the towering glass buildings. She turned her back to the skyline she had drafted by hand. She began walking toward the city limits. The wind blew hard against her lined face. The rain fell steadily into her silver hair. She kept the brass key clutched tightly in her right hand inside her pocket. The metal slowly warmed against her skin. She walked past the expensive boutiques and the polished restaurants. She watched the wealthy patrons drinking wine behind condensation-covered windows. She walked past the people hurrying under large black umbrellas. No one looked at the elderly woman carrying a wet canvas bag. She walked until the concrete sidewalks turned into broken asphalt. She walked until the tall streetlights were replaced by leaning wooden utility poles. She walked until the city noise faded into the sound of wet wind. She walked past the abandoned gas stations and the empty gravel lots. The city she built slowly disappeared behind her in the heavy fog. She walked for 3 hours without stopping once. Her knees ached with a sharp, grinding pain. Her lower back throbbed heavily with every forward step. Her soaked shoes blistered the heels of both feet. She did not stop walking. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark, tree-lined horizon ahead. She kept walking. The rain turned into a blinding sheet of freezing grey ice. Eleanor's knees finally gave out entirely at the edge of the county line. She dragged her wet canvas bag under the faded canvas awning of a general store. Her right shoe sole had begun to peel away from the damp leather. She had tied it together with a piece of muddy twine found in a ditch. The small town consisted of a single, cracked asphalt main street. A gas station with 2 rusted analog pumps sat quietly across the road. A small diner with red checkered curtains glowed faintly through steamed front glass. A man in a heavy flannel shirt stepped out of the general store. He carried a worn wooden broom and a dented metal dustpan. He stopped sweeping when he saw the exhausted woman in the dripping navy coat. He looked at her wet silver hair and her scuffed, broken shoes. He looked at the heavy brass key resting against her collarbone outside her collar. "You're Eleanor," the man said quietly. Eleanor gripped the handle of her canvas bag, but did not speak. "My father was the groundskeeper for the old estate 40 years ago," he said. "His name was Thomas. I'm Thomas Jr." He leaned his broom against the wet brick wall of the store. "He told me," Arthur said, "to watch for a woman with a brass key on a leather cord." He looked directly at the tarnished metal on her chest. "We've been waiting for you." He pointed a calloused finger down the cracked, empty road. "It's another half-mile past the diner." Eleanor picked up her wet canvas bag without a single word. She walked the final stretch of broken road until the wrought iron gates appeared. The Victorian mansion was much worse than David's boardroom reports had claimed. The second-floor balcony had collapsed completely into the overgrown front yard. The heavy slate roof sagged dangerously in the center of the structure. Black mold covered the original white wood siding in thick, dark streaks. She stood in the freezing mud and considered turning back to the city shelter. Then she saw a small movement under the rotting porch stairs. A gaunt, grey stray cat sat perfectly still in the dry dust. It watched her with unblinking, bright yellow eyes. It did not run from the violent storm. It did not retreat into the shadows when she approached the broken wood. Her children had packed her belongings and ordered her to leave. This small, starving creature stayed exactly where it was. Eleanor tightened her grip on the heavy brass key. She pushed through the dead rhododendron bushes on the eastern side of the house. She forced the rusted lock to turn and pushed the heavy wooden door inward. She stepped out of the freezing storm and into the pitch-black hallway. The heavy door dragged shut against the swollen floorboards. She was finally inside. The first night on the hardwood floor fractured her lower back. She folded her fraying navy coat into a thin, uneven square. She placed it under her hips to cushion her fragile bones. Her green canvas bag served as a dense, uncomfortable pillow. The freezing draft blew steadily through the shattered parlor windows. She woke at dawn with her knuckles completely stiff and swollen. Her right knee ground with a sharp, sickening click when she stood. She began a strict, deliberate routine the very next morning. She walked to the general store and spent $3.40. She bought a large paper bag of rolled oats and a box of matches. She counted her remaining $10.72 carefully. She walked the half-mile back to the estate in the freezing drizzle. She found a stiff-bristled push broom in the collapsed pantry. She swept 30 years of accumulated dirt from the parlor floor. She worked in slow, deliberate grids across the massive room. Her shoulders burned with a deep, searing ache. She created a clean space exactly 10 feet by 10 feet. This small square became her sanctuary against the surrounding decay. She found a cracked plastic bucket in the overgrown rear garden. She scrubbed it clean with handfuls of wet, abrasive sand. She positioned it under a leaking gutter to catch the rain. She drank the cold, metallic-tasting water from her cupped palms. She scavenged heavy, rotting tarps from the collapsed carriage house. She dragged them across the muddy yard, using her entire body weight. She nailed the thick plastic over the broken window frames. She used a smooth, heavy river stone instead of a hammer. She pulled rusted nails from the broken porch floorboards one by one. Her cuticles bled freely, staining the white wood with bright crimson. She did not stop until the main parlor was sealed from the wind. Thomas arrived on her third afternoon without knocking. He pushed through the dead rhododendron bushes carrying a heavy wooden toolbox. He wore his thick flannel shirt and mud-caked leather work boots. He did not ask how she was surviving in the freezing damp. He walked directly to the shattered front doors and began pulling plywood. He replaced the rotting wood with solid pine boards he brought himself. He installed a heavy brass deadbolt using a battery-powered drill. He left a thermos of hot chicken broth on the dusty windowsill. He packed his tools and walked back toward the main road. He asked for absolutely nothing in return. The worst storm hit on her 7th night in the house. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single, brutal hour. Ice formed in sharp shards on the inside of the plastic tarps. The parlor ceiling began to leak directly over her sleeping area. Freezing water dripped steadily onto her wool coat. Her left knee swelled until the fabric of her trousers stretched tight. Her hands shook so violently she could not open Thomas's thermos. She sat in the freezing darkness and pulled out her mobile phone. The battery icon flashed red in the top corner of the cracked screen. She opened her call log one final time. 0 missed calls from David. 0 messages from Sarah. The screen went completely black, and the phone died in her palm. She set the useless plastic rectangle onto the wet floorboards. She thought, I cannot fix a leaking slate roof. I am 72 years old with $10.72. I cannot pay a contractor, and I cannot climb a 3-story ladder. The cold in her hands was turning from deep pain into heavy numbness. She pulled her knees against her chest and leaned against the wall. She thought, this is where I die. Not tonight, but this is how it ends. This is what dying discarded looks like. A low, scratchy sound came from the shadows near the fireplace. The gaunt, grey, stray cat walked slowly across the wet floor. It stopped exactly 1 inch from her wet leather shoe. It sat down in the freezing puddle and looked directly up at her. It did not shiver and it did not look away. Eleanor looked at the starving animal. She looked down at her own trembling, calloused hands. She looked at the dead phone her children would never call. She felt the heavy brass key resting against her collarbone. She pushed her palms flat against the wet, freezing wood. She forced her stiff, aching knees to straighten completely. She stood up in the dark and looked at the leaking ceiling. I am not dying in this ruined house, she said aloud. I am not dying because 2 arrogant children decided I was obsolete. I built them from nothing. I am still here. She picked up the cracked plastic bucket with a steady hand. She walked across the room and placed it directly under the leak. She knelt down and lifted the wet, shivering cat into her arms. She carried it to the driest corner of the parlor. She sat back down and wrapped her damp coat around them both. She kept breathing. The storm broke just after sunrise on the 8th day. Pale morning light filtered through the clear plastic tarps. The grey cat stretched its thin legs and walked out of the parlor. Eleanor followed the small animal down the dark central hallway. The cat turned left into Arthur's ruined ground-floor study. The floorboards here were completely warped by decades of dampness. Tall, empty oak bookshelves lined the eastern wall from floor to ceiling. The cat walked directly to the center of the largest bookcase. It sat down on the dusty wood floor. It stared intently at the solid oak paneling between the empty shelves. It raised one grey paw and scratched at the smooth wood. Eleanor knelt painfully beside the animal. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet room. She looked closely at the dark oak grain. There was no handle. There were no hinges. But there was a tiny circular shadow carved into a wooden knot. She pressed her calloused thumb against the dark circle. The wood was perfectly smooth, but the shadow remained. She leaned closer until her face was inches from the shelf. The circle was not a knot in the wood. It was a perfectly disguised brass keyhole. The metal had tarnished black, blending completely with the dark oak. Eleanor's breathing stopped entirely in her tight chest. She reached inside her collar with trembling fingers. She pulled the braided leather cord over her silver hair. She held the heavy brass key in her right hand. The smooth, worn side of the metal caught the pale morning light. She guided the key into the hidden lock. It slid forward flawlessly without a single sound. She turned her wrist to the right. A heavy, internal steel mechanism disengaged with a deep thud. The entire center section of the oak bookcase swung outward. A narrow, windowless room sat hidden behind the wall. The air inside smelled faintly of Arthur's cheap tobacco. Thick dust covered a small wooden desk and a single metal filing cabinet. A black leather lockbox sat squarely in the center of the desk. Eleanor walked slowly into the hidden space. Her hands shook so violently she dropped the brass key. It hit the wooden floor with a sharp metallic clatter. The cat walked in and sat beside the fallen key. Eleanor reached for the latch on the leather box. She flipped the unsealed metal clasp open. She lifted the heavy leather lid. A thick stack of yellowing legal paper rested inside. The top page bore the official seal of the state registry. The paper felt heavy and brittle. The black ink was perfectly preserved inside the dark box. She traced the embossed state seal with her index finger. The ridges of the seal were sharp against her skin. She picked up the first document with both hands. Her eyes scanned the bold black type at the top. It read, Master Irrevocable Trust of the Vance Corporation. She frowned in deep confusion. David had said the holding company was left entirely to him. She read the first paragraph. She did not understand the dense legal terminology immediately. She read the second paragraph. The words sole and absolute executor stood out clearly. She set the paper down on the dusty desk. She wiped her trembling hands on her wet trousers. She picked the paper up again 5 seconds later. She read the exact same lines a second time. Her lungs burned. She realized she was not taking in any air. She forced herself to exhale a long, shaky breath. She looked at the date stamped at the bottom. 1992. The year the company faced bankruptcy. The year she quietly sold her inherited silver to pay the crews. She read the third paragraph, tracing the words with her finger. The scale of what she was holding finally locked into place. Arthur had not left the holding company to the children. He had transferred the entire corporate empire into a blind trust. The trust named Eleanor as the sole, unchallengeable executor. David and Sarah were only authorized to manage daily operations. They had no legal authority to liquidate assets. They had no legal authority to sell this Victorian estate. Their eviction notice was entirely fraudulent. They had forged the board's unanimous consent documents. Every decision they had made since Arthur's death was legally void. She held the absolute control of a billion-dollar empire in her hands. She turned to the second page. A handwritten letter rested beneath the trust documents. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Arthur's. She read his sharp, jagged cursive. "They will try to take it all from you, Elle. They think they built this. They didn't. We did. The key is yours. Take it all back." She read the jagged cursive a second time. She read it a third time. The silence in the hidden room was absolute. Eleanor lowered the paper slowly to the dusty desk. She looked at the grey cat sitting on the floor. She looked at the heavy brass key resting beside its paws. Her hands stopped shaking completely. The deep ache in her fractured back disappeared. She touched the dry, yellowed paper with her calloused thumb. "You knew exactly who they were," she said to the empty room. "You knew what they would do to me." She folded the trust documents precisely in half. She slid them into the deep right pocket of her worn navy coat. She reached down and picked up the brass key. She closed her fist tightly around the metal. It was finally time to build something new. Eleanor did not take the trust documents to a lawyer immediately. She left them folded securely inside her deep coat pocket. She walked out of the hidden study and into the ruined parlor. She picked up a charred piece of wood from the cold fireplace. She knelt on the sweeping grid she had cleared days ago. Her right knee clicked loudly against the hardwood floor. She began to draw structural blueprints directly onto the bare floorboards. She drafted load-bearing calculations using the black charcoal. She measured the sagging ceiling joists using a long piece of muddy twine. Thomas arrived the next morning with his heavy wooden toolbox. He brought a flatbed truck loaded with salvaged pine planks. He had pulled the wood from a collapsed barn on his own property. Eleanor handed him the twine measurements and pointed to her floor drawings. Thomas looked at the complex mathematical load equations drawn in black ash. He looked at the 72-year-old woman in the fraying wool coat. He picked up a heavy wooden beam without asking a single question. They worked together for 3 straight weeks in the freezing damp. Eleanor could not lift the heavy timber beams herself. Her swollen knuckles locked painfully when the temperature dropped below freezing, but she directed every single cut of the steel handsaw. She showed Thomas exactly how to brace the sagging roof joists. They used the salvaged pine to build strong structural supports. They pulled thick ivy vines from the exterior brick walls by hand. Eleanor's fingernails chipped and bled against the rough mortar. She scrubbed the black mold from the white siding using sand and rainwater. She patched the shattered windows with thick, clear glass Thomas found at the dump. They resealed the heavy slate roof with boiling tar and copper flashing. Eleanor climbed the first 2 rungs of the heavy wooden ladder herself. She handed the heavy tar buckets up to Thomas one by one. Her shoulders burned with a deep, searing ache every single night. They moved to the sagging front veranda on the 5th week. The wooden porch pillars were completely rotted at the stone bases. Eleanor designed a temporary load-bearing cradle out of scrap steel pipes. She cranked a heavy mechanical jack by hand to lift the porch roof. The iron handle tore a thick blister open across her right palm. She wrapped the open wound tight with a strip of torn fabric. She kept cranking the heavy iron handle until the roof leveled. Thomas removed the rotting wood and poured fresh concrete footings. They installed solid oak posts, sourced from a fallen tree by the river. Eleanor stripped the peeling green paint from the massive front double doors. She used a dull metal scraper and raw, blistering chemical solvent. The brass key swung heavily against her chest as she worked. It was covered in white dust and flecks of old green paint. She did not tuck it away inside her collar anymore. She let the heavy metal rest openly over her fraying wool sweater. They moved into the ruined kitchen next. The original cast-iron stove was buried under collapsed ceiling plaster. Eleanor dug the heavy appliance out, using only a rusted metal trowel. She scrubbed the rusted iron grates with wire brushes and coarse salt. Her lower back throbbed deeply every time she bent over the metal. She polished the black iron with linseed oil until it shone brightly. Thomas climbed the brick chimney and cleared the decades of dead leaves. Eleanor struck a match and lit the first fire in 30 years. Thick white smoke pulled perfectly up the dark brick flue. The cast-iron metal radiated intense, steady heat across the cold room. The grey cat jumped onto the warm hearth and curled into a tight circle. Eleanor boiled a dented metal kettle on the front iron burner. She made Thomas a cup of instant black coffee in a cracked ceramic mug. He sat on a flipped wooden crate and drank it in complete silence. By the 6th week, the deep structural groaning of the house stopped entirely. The freezing wind no longer blew through the central hallway. She found 3 cans of hardened floor wax in the dry basement. She melted the thick wax down slowly over the restored stove. She poured the hot liquid over the scuffed parlor floorboards. She rubbed the wax into the wood using heavy, circular motions. She used a torn piece of her own discarded bedsheet as a rag. The repetitive motion sent sharp, shooting pains up her right forearm. She ignored the pain and kept polishing the wood for 6 hours. The moment of genuine beauty happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor stood in the center of the main parlor with a wet rag. She wiped the last layer of grey dust from the massive front bay window. Late afternoon sunlight poured directly through the clean, clear glass. The golden light hit the newly waxed original oak floorboards. It illuminated the rich, deep red grain of the polished wood perfectly. The house was breathing again. Eleanor woke before dawn on the 42nd day. She did not reach for the cracked mobile phone on the floor. She picked it up and dropped it directly into the cast-iron stove. The plastic casing melted instantly against the bright orange coals. She took the fraudulent eviction notice from her green canvas bag. She fed the thick, stapled pages into the fire one by one. The heavy corporate seal burned away in seconds. She watched the black ink curl and turn to grey ash. She thought, "I am not a discarded widow. I am the architect who poured the concrete for their entire world." The tight, heavy knot behind her ribs completely dissolved. Her lungs expanded fully for the first time in 2 months. She breathed the smell of wood smoke and clean pine. The air felt physically lighter in her chest. She walked into the quiet, sunlit study. She stood in front of the hidden oak room. The heavy brass key rested warmly against her collarbone. She touched the smooth, tarnished metal with her calloused thumb. "You built the facade, Arthur," she said to the empty room, "but I built the foundation, and the foundation is mine." The grey cat rubbed its side against her frayed trouser leg. The community began to arrive 2 days later. Eleanor did not put up signs, and she did not ask for help. Thomas had simply spoken about the woman measuring roof joists with twine. A pickup truck crunched up the repaired gravel driveway on Thursday morning. A woman in a thick wool sweater stepped out carrying 2 large baskets. She walked onto the newly leveled front veranda. She set the baskets down on the clean oak floorboards. They were filled with winter squash, dried beans, and fresh apples. "My father was the foreman on the 3rd Street Bridge project," the woman said. "He said, you mediated the steel strike in the freezing rain. He said you saved his pension when the banks pulled out." Eleanor accepted the baskets without looking away. She invited the woman inside to sit by the cast-iron stove. A retired electrician arrived on Saturday in a rusted blue van. He brought coils of heavy copper wire and a wooden crate of fixtures. "I wired the downtown high-rises from your blueprints," he told her. "Your load calculations were never wrong by a single inch." He spent 3 days rewiring the parlor out of pure respect. He refused to take a single dollar from her small leather purse. A young carpenter appeared the following week with a truckload of milled oak. He had heard the original architect of the city was rebuilding the estate. He wanted to learn how she drafted structural joints without a computer. Eleanor cleared a wide space on the clean parlor floor. She knelt down with a piece of black charcoal. She drew the complex geometric angles directly onto the wood. The young man sat beside her and copied her lines into a notebook. More vehicles began parking along the dead rhododendron bushes. People brought salvaged glass, brass hinges, and gallons of white paint. They brought heavy woolen blankets and jars of preserved vegetables. They did not bring these things out of pity for an old woman. They brought them as tribute to the builder they had never forgotten. The abandoned mansion became a loud, active construction site. The sound of hammers and handsaws echoed through the valley all day. Eleanor directed every single detail of the massive restoration. She stood on the veranda in her worn navy coat and pointed. She showed the volunteers exactly how to sister the rotting floor joists. She taught them how to mix mortar using the 19th century ratios. She moved through the crowded rooms with perfect, quiet authority. The brass key swung visibly over her chest as she worked. She found a heavy oak table buried in the cellar. She dragged it up the stairs with the help of the electrician. She set it up in the exact center of the main parlor. This became her new structural drafting board. She did not hide it in a cramped kitchen corner. She placed it directly in the brightest square of afternoon sunlight. She drafted plans for a massive greenhouse using the carpenter's paper. She used a straight piece of sanded pine wood as a ruler. Her knuckles still ached deeply in the freezing early mornings, but her hands no longer shook when she held the black charcoal. A baker from the town square arrived on a Tuesday morning. He brought a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven filled with fresh sourdough bread. He walked into the parlor and placed it on her drafting table. He wiped white flour from his thick canvas apron. "You approved the commercial loan for my bakery 20 years ago," he said. "You signed the bank draft yourself when the corporate board voted no." Eleanor broke the warm bread with her bare, calloused hands. She handed a large piece to the baker and ate a piece herself. The thick crust tasted strongly of sea salt and wood smoke. It was the first fresh meal she had eaten in 2 months. She chewed slowly and looked around the busy, bright room. The walls were solid and the roof was completely sealed. The town had recognized her before her own children ever did. A sleek black luxury SUV crunched up the freshly laid gravel driveway on a Thursday. The heavy tires stopped exactly at the edge of the new concrete porch footings. Thomas stopped running, his steel hand saw through a thick pine plank. The young carpenter set his heavy wooden toolbox down on the dry grass. They watched in complete silence as the heavy car doors opened. David stepped out of the driver's side wearing a tailored charcoal suit. He stepped carefully over a pile of clean pine sawdust in his polished leather shoes. Sarah stepped out of the passenger side, holding a thin leather folder. She wore a heavy camel cashmere coat and large, dark sunglasses. 2 men in sharp grey suits stepped out of the back seats. They unrolled wide, glossy architectural blueprints across the warm hood of the vehicle. David and Sarah stopped and stared at the restored massive front double doors. They looked at the clear glass installed securely in the massive bay windows. They saw the heavy slate roof completely sealed and perfectly aligned. Eleanor stood on the wide wooden veranda in her worn navy coat. The heavy brass key hung openly over her frayed wool sweater. David walked up the solid oak porch steps and forced a warm, polished smile. "We've been so worried about you, Mom," he said smoothly. He did not look at her calloused, blistered hands. The facility called and said, "You never arrived." Sarah stepped up beside him and tapped the leather folder against her palm. "You've done a very nice job cleaning up the debris here," Sarah said gently. "But we are just being realistic. At your age, this isn't a safe environment." David reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out an expensive silver pen. "Those men are commercial developers from the city," David said. "They want this exact acreage for a massive regional distribution center. We just need your signature on this final quitclaim deed to clear the title. We'll make sure you get a very comfortable apartment in the city." Eleanor did not look at the silver pen. She looked at the perfectly manicured hands holding the fraudulent paperwork. She reached into the deep right pocket of her worn navy coat. She pulled out the thick, folded stack of yellowing legal paper. She unfolded the document and smoothed it flat against the solid oak porch railing. The heavy embossed seal of the state registry caught the bright afternoon sunlight. She slid the brittle paper across the wood directly toward her son. "You evicted me to liquidate the company assets," Eleanor said quietly. "You forged the board's unanimous consent documents to take the penthouse." David looked down at the old yellowed paper. His eyes caught the bold black type printed at the very top. He read the words, "Master Irrevocable Trust." The smooth, polished smile vanished completely from his face in 1 second. His expensive silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the wooden deck. It rolled off the edge and fell into the damp earth below the porch. Sarah pulled her dark sunglasses slowly down the bridge of her nose. She leaned over and read the second paragraph of the aged page. She read the words sole and absolute executor out loud in a breathless whisper. The thin leather folder dropped from her hands onto the clean oak floorboards. "You don't own the holding company," Eleanor said in a perfectly calm voice. "Your father transferred the entire corporate empire into a blind trust. I am the sole executor of every single asset." David opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked at the towering restored mansion and then back at his mother. "I drafted the structural blueprints for your entire lives," Eleanor said. "I built the concrete foundation you stood on. You thought I was obsolete because my name was not on the modern letterhead." She picked the yellowed trust document back up and folded it neatly. She slid the absolute control of a billion-dollar empire back into her coat pocket. "You will return to the city immediately," Eleanor said to the two silent adults. "You will pack your personal belongings and leave the corporate offices. The corporate attorneys will contact you in the morning regarding the criminal forgery." David took one step backward toward the wooden stairs. "Mom, please," he whispered, staring blindly at the pocket holding the document. "We are still a family. We can figure this out." Eleanor looked at the son who had handed her a bus ticket 2 months ago. She looked at the daughter who had told her it was a clean break. She reached up and touched the heavy brass key resting against her chest. She did not raise her voice. She did not smile or show any vindictive triumph. "You are standing on my property," Eleanor said. She turned around and walked through the heavy front double doors. The deadbolt clicked into place. 6 months later, the early spring wind blew gently across the completely restored estate. Eleanor sat at the heavy oak drafting table in the center of the main parlor. She wore a clean white cotton shirt and sturdy canvas trousers. The fraying navy wool coat hung permanently on a solid iron hook by the door. The grey cat slept, stretched out in a square of bright morning sunlight. Through the clear glass bay windows, the new timber-framed greenhouse caught the light. Thomas was outside carrying a large wooden crate of green seedlings. He set them down next to the finished cedar planting beds. Eleanor looked down at her own hands resting on the oak table. The winter blisters had healed into thick, permanent white scars across her palms. Her knuckles no longer ached when she opened her fingers. She picked up a smooth, heavy river stone from the desk. She placed it deliberately over the curling edge of a fresh architectural blueprint. The crisp white paper detailed the structural framing for a free community trade school. The corporate attorneys had executed the trust documents perfectly over the winter. The holding company and its millions were now entirely under her direct control. David and Sarah had been immediately removed from the glass penthouse. They had been stripped of their executive titles and their corporate access. They lived in a small rented apartment on the industrial side of the city. Eleanor did not check her phone for their messages. She reached up to the back of her neck with steady hands. She untied the tight knot in the braided leather cord. She pulled the heavy brass key away from her collarbone for the final time. The metal was dark and completely smooth on one side from decades of wear. She stood up and walked into the bright, sunlit study. The hidden oak bookcase panel was permanently pushed wide open. The dark, windowless room was now flooded with natural light from the hallway. She set the brass key down inside the open black leather lockbox. She left the heavy leather lid flipped entirely backward against the desk. There were no more secrets to carry in the dark. She looked at the clean oak floorboards she had restored by hand. The foundation held. "Arthur," she said to the quiet, empty room. "But I finished the house myself." She walked back into the sun. The rusted iron gates of the estate were permanently removed by the third spring. The repaired gravel driveway remained wide open to anyone who wanted to learn the trade. The gaunt grey cat grew thick and healthy in the warm timber greenhouse. Thomas Jr. became the head foreman of her new community construction trust. The old drafting table in the parlor was always covered in fresh white paper. Eleanor never returned to the towering glass buildings in the city center. She did not need the cold marble floors or the silent penthouse mornings. She had the smell of fresh pine sawdust and hot black coffee. She had the absolute respect of the people who actually understood her work. She had the heavy cast-iron stove she dug out of the rubble herself. David and Sarah spent their days in endless legal depositions with corporate auditors. They learned exactly how much the silent architect had managed for 40 years. They discovered they could not answer a single technical question about their own properties. The corporate board formally dissolved their executive contracts by the end of the year. They learned that polished cruelty is entirely useless against a solid foundation. Eleanor Vance spent her entire life building quiet strength for arrogant people. When they evicted her from the glass tower, she simply reclaimed the original estate. She spent her final years surrounded by the people she actually chose. She proved that the person who knows how to build the walls holds the actual power. The people who merely sign the paper are always entirely replaceable. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever watched someone try to erase your decades of sacrifice with a single cruel decision, leave one word in the comments, describing the moment Eleanor slid the true trust document across the solid oak porch. Railing, because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. The hands that know how to build can always construct a new sanctuary from the ruins of betrayal. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their uncredited labor still holds immense, undeniable power, because together we prove that dreams don't age.